Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, I think. Well, afternoon and morning for both of you. Welcome to Motivating the Virtual Learner. My name is Rachel Dillon, and I've been building learning experiences for children, teachers at the college level, and in the corporate level for the past 15 years. I facilitated curriculum online, in person, and in blended arenas. And the three questions I always start with when developing or delivering any learning experience is, why is this educational experience needed? Who is the audience? And what motivates them? And sometimes answering that question, that last question about motivation, is the hardest, which is why over the next 24 minutes, zip zoom, I'm going to try to provide you with concepts and theories that might unravel that question a bit. But before we do that, let's go ahead and get a little information from you as the audience. So because I won't be able to see the chat or the thumbs up emotion, emoticons, please put a Y or an N if you have a hobby, something you do for fun and want to improve that skill. This is something you do because you want to do it, because it brings you enjoyment, and it's not because somebody has asked you to do it. So Y's or no's on that one. All right, as we wait for those coming in, let's go ahead on this one. How many of you have used a YouTube video to get answers to very defined questions? So put a Y or an N in chat. Getting answers to very defined questions. And this is like, I'm going in there and I have to do a pivot table in Excel, and I've never done that before, or I only do that every 6 months. And if you said yes, you're part of the 2.49 billion monthly active users on YouTube. Okay, last question for a Y or an N. How many of you have had a virtual learning experience that you ended up multitasking during? And while you were entering those in, I ask these three questions because we can all relate to something we're motivated by. And as the last question shows, we've all been demotivated during virtual experiences. So as learning professionals, knowing what pulls people away is just as important as knowing what pulls people in to that learning experience. So I thought I'd start off with those demotivators. And I'm going to talk a little bit about an experience I had recently, building knowledge on the industry I'm in right now, which is the energy utility. And I certainly had a demotivating virtual experience. First of all, the instructor was boring. Boring meaning he spoke at a very, bland level, one, oh, click next. You almost can hear the Bueller. He also had a tendency to be condescending. So when someone asked a question, he would almost make a note like, well, that's an easy question. Or he would actually add in irrelevant information that had nothing to do with what we were learning. He also provided too much content so that information that I was receiving was just too dense. And then he had a lot of information on the slide, and he had a visual. He had like the video running at the same time. And so I was reading the slide, but he was saying something different. So I was hearing different information from what was on the slide. And the result was my attention was split. And I was trying to learn, well, should I listen to him or should I read this? And the amount of time and effort and energy I was putting into it actually was draining, especially after hour number 2. The content was too complex. He would start speaking at a level that I didn't understand, and he wasn't building the knowledge in a way for me to understand a little bit at a time. He didn't even have interactivity in this experience. So I was sitting there listening and waiting. So when he would say, okay, we're going to start moving on, I'm guessing you don't have any questions. And all of a sudden we would be like, okay, well, I guess I don't, because if I do have a question, that means that maybe I'm not very smart. And last, of course, closest to my heart, is the visuals and design were overwhelming. There wasn't enough, or there just wasn't something that was pulling me in or drawing me to it, or it was skewed, or there wasn't consistency between things. And all of these things make it harder for someone to stay motivated to learn, to remember the material. And at the end of the day, I was like, was this really worth my time? So, what stops instructional designers from keeping the audience in mind? So, we're flipping over. So, we just talked about, okay, this is how it affected me as a learner. But if I'm the instructional designer, how do I keep the audience in mind? And what's stopping me from doing that? Because frequently we're not always in the best ability to create the most engaging, the most motivating information. And so understanding what's stopping us is also important. Sometimes it's working with SMEs, subject matter experts, or you are the subject matter expert and you're too close to the content. So you can't see, well, do I really need to put all of this in? Or do I need to cram it all in because I want them to be as much of an expert at the end of this 45 minutes as I am? Right? So that always becomes a problem with not thinking about that audience. Check the box training is another area that we get kind of, locked in with as instructional designers or facilitators, like, yeah, well, they have to take this training. It doesn't matter who the audience is. And I don't really care if they're motivated because they got to take it. It's just they've got to attest to doing this. It might be regulated or required. You might have a place of history here where they're just like, well, this is the way we've always done it. And so as an instructional designer, you might think, oh, okay, well, I guess this is the way it is. And of course, last but not least, the lack of time for development. And I'm guessing you've all heard a little bit more and more and more about AI and how it can build our efficiency as instructional designers and educators. But still, that lack of time for development can also draw away from keeping the audience in mind. And if we're not keeping the audience in mind, how are we going to keep them motivated? The virtual space can be a tough place for both teaching in and learning in. And a lot of pressure is put on the facilitator and technology to keep learners motivated. And it's easier to be disconnected from the material and distracted by people and things around us. And web-based training, oh my gosh, that can be even trickier because there isn't a way for the learner to ask questions and to get immediate feedback. So there's a lot at play to be successful as a learner and an educator in the virtual space. So I thought I'd turn to three famous learning scientists, Malcolm Knowles, Cyril Houle, and Raymond Lakowski, who did their research and wrote their papers when virtual education wasn't mainstream. And I wanted to test to see if their theories were still applicable 20, 40, 60 years later. So that's why we're focused on motivation, and that's why we're focused on the learning environment to see what can we actually pull out from history and from those researchers and apply it today in the virtual space. We're going to start off by talking about, because this presentation is about the adult learner, we're going to be starting off by talking about one of the more famous learning scientists and educators, Malcolm Knowles and andragogy, the methods of teaching adult learners. In the 1970s and 80s, Malcolm Knowles argued that adult education needed to be handled differently than children's education. Knowles developed the first systematic formulation laying out the differences between young learners and adult learners. And although his research occurred over 40 years ago, I have to admit that not much has changed with adult learner characteristics. One of that first adult learner characteristic to tie into is the need to know. Why am I here at this class? What's in it for me? Which is why explaining the importance of the information up front and how it will benefit them is so important. We have limited time. If I'm signing up for a class, I want to know it's worth my time. I am going to be applying what I'm going to be able to learn. The next thing that comes into the classroom is the experience as adults. Now, these experiences for an educator can be pulled upon and drawn upon to pull into storytelling, to pull into scenarios. And it can make it easier for an instructor or educator by tapping into those experiences. But it can also be a challenge as people get set in their ways. And different ways of thinking, it could reduce their ability to be open-minded. And also, if they've had bad experiences related to education in the past, they may bring those biases in with them as well. All right, the third assumption about adult learner characteristics is the self-concept. And these are all things we can take into consideration when we're developing and delivering information. So the self-concept, they want to be in control of their learning decisions, which is probably why mandatory training gets such a bad rap, because resentment and resistance can occur when adults are being told what they have to do, or in their kind of mind, sometimes they're being treated like children. The fourth is the readiness to learn, which is usually based on our social roles. You know, as an employee or spouse or partner or parent or community member, these roles tend to change as we grow old, and so does what we're ready to learn about. So when we're in high school, most high schoolers aren't thinking, gosh, I should probably start saving for retirement. But certainly as we creep into our 30s and 40s and we're watching our parents retire and we're saying, gosh, do I have enough money to be doing that safely? Our readiness to learn is going to shift and change. Number 5, problem center oriented. So adults don't want the generic stuff. They want specific skills or an opportunity to learn how to solve a problem. And knowing this motivation for adults has inspired things like gamification in learning and scenario-based learning. So the last one to talk about is the 6th assumption of adult learning characteristics, internal motivation. We are learning to live a happier life. We are learning for job satisfaction. We are learning for personal fulfillment. But outside of that internal motivation, motivation actually comes from 2 different places. It could be intrinsic, or it could be extrinsic, or sometimes both. So give me a Y or an N, and I know it's a hard environment to give feedback, but let me know if you've heard of or have read the book written by Marie Kondo. It's called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And one of her big questions when choosing to keep something or give it away is to ask yourself, does this bring me joy? Now, what if we looked at information the same way? Because joy is a motivator. And what if we looked at learning the same way? And it doesn't mean that everything we teach brings the learner joy, but rather, does it give them something that matters to them? And that's a perfect example of asking an intrinsic question. So intrinsic motivators engage in behavior because it's personally rewarding, kind of as we talked about at the beginning when I asked you for whys and ends. So intrinsic motivators tend to be long-lasting and self-sustaining. We're driven to learn more, so it produces higher levels of creativity for ourselves, to innovate for personal growth. And on the other side, we also have extrinsic motivation, and that is behavior that's driven by external rewards, something tangible and measurable. So money, promotion, fame, grades, a degree, praise, raises, badges. And of course, we've got an extrinsic motivator, punishment. You kind of have that on the top, on your shoulder when you're driving over the speed limit, or when you're kind of like, yeah, there's nobody around. Do I really need to come to a full stop? The consequence, if we get caught, that punishment is an extrinsic motivator. These tend to be short-term and dependent on external factors. And when the goal is met, they then lose some of that interest. Okay, this might be a little tricky, but in the chat, can you think of situations where an intrinsic motivator, something that you love to do, could turn extrinsic, that you're doing for the reward? So, the illustration on the screen kind of gives you a little hint as to one of those situations. So and I'm sure as you're thinking, okay, what could be an intrinsic motivator at the start and turn extrinsic? So if we look at artists, they may be doing that art because it brings them joy. It's something they love to do. Then all of a sudden someone asks, hey, could I buy that piece? And you say, yes, yes. And then you do another. And then maybe you start looking at, maybe I could get an Etsy store. Maybe I could get into a gallery. Maybe I could make copies of my pieces. Oh, I need to do more pieces because then it's bringing in more income. So it doesn't mean that it's bad, but an intrinsic motivator could actually become extrinsic. On the reverse, we have some external motivators that could factor in to drive positive behavior. And with careful application, hopefully by an educator, extrinsic motivation can result in intrinsic motivation. So let's say you get news that, your doctor's like, hey, if you don't lose weight, you're gonna shorten your lifespan. And you're like, ugh, I don't like, um, I don't like to be, unhealthy, but I also don't like working out and I don't like changing the way I eat, but okay, I'm going to do it anyway. And all of a sudden you're starting to do these things because you simply enjoy it, because you find it fulfilling. There was a learning scientist that focused his research on internal and external motivators for adults, and that was Cyril Houle. He initiated the exploration of motivation in adult learning in the 1960s. Okay, so we're over 60 years ago that this scientist was really thinking outside the box there. And what he came up with was 3 types of learning orientations. And let's look at this from the virtual space uh, and see how we can apply these 3 types of learning orientations here in the virtual environment. So his first learning orientation is to be goal oriented. So we've got learners that come into this space and they're just like, you know what, I'm motivated by the goals. So as instructional designers, we can provide them with progress status, a progress bar. Hey, you're 25% done with this training. That motivation to say, okay, I'm moving right along and I'm going to get there. Competition. I know a lot of people use Kahoot to ask questions to see who can answer those questions first. That is a goal-oriented motivator. Giving badges to collect or share, or levels of mastery. So you complete level 100, now you're moving into 200 and 300, and boy, does that feel good, right? You've also got learners that are motivated by activities. They're an activity-oriented motivations. And this is where they actually want to join in because of the social aspect of that learning environment. And so we can do that virtually by putting in breakout rooms and chats and polls, asking people to turn on their cameras. In web-based training, pulling in scenario-based problems, storytelling, talking head videos. So we're humanizing that training as well. And then the last type of learning oriented adult is those are learning oriented. They're there to learn because of the love of learning, that complete intrinsic motivation. And as instructional designers, this is actually the most fun to build in because you can add the details, you can make it longer, you can add videos that show how to do something, opportunities to follow along, include experts for interviews and build their knowledge from beginner to expert levels. And of course, provide them with resources to learn more. That motivation is really strong and powerful. Now you can put all of these elements into a virtual experience by knowing your audience and the reasons they're investing their very valuable time in the learning experience. But there's one more element that I want to mention that can be a big factor in motivating or demotivating the learner. Excuse me, as I need to swallow. And that is creating a comfortable learning environment. I read the research of Raymond Lakowski to see what his ideas were around motivation and learning based on that environment. And I loved this quote. If something can be learned, it can be learned in a motivating manner. Every instructional plan also needs to be a motivational plan. Wow. Raymond Lakowski came up with these 4 integrated conditions of adult motivation. So let's look at that. And of course, I point out that he does this in 2008. So, if we look at a timeline in virtual learning, it still is not mainstream to be learning virtually. But in 2006, the massive open online courses, MOOCs, by Canadian and American universities was launched. So it was starting to move that direction. So let's look at these 4 integrated conditions by Raymond Lakowski. He said that at the beginning of the lesson, the most important thing is to establish inclusion. You're opening the mind to be motivated to learn, and the goal is to promote a learning community so that everyone feels respected and connected. As instructional designers, that means make learning accessible, and the instructor is really an important element in making sure that it's a safe place to ask questions or find resources that builds trust and lowers learners' anxiety. And it also is important for instructional designers to make sure the graphics are inclusive and diverse so the audience feels respected. His second element is creating positive attitudes towards the material that are being learned. And this can be done by establishing topic relevance and learner expectations. By me bringing in the opportunity for you to think about, well, when am I motivated to learn something? Actually talks about, hey, this is relevant to you. If as an educator or as an instructional designer, we all are a part of learning. Then the third one is as we move into our learning experience is enhancing the meaning. And this can be done by creating challenging and engaging experiences that celebrate the learner's viewpoints and values. Obviously, in 25 minutes, I'm not able to really engage closely with you, in this learning experience. So hopefully these words are going to carry through with you. But in the enhancing meaning, it's really about capturing the learner's attention with stories, scenarios, and activities that celebrates and reinforces what people are learning. And last, engendering confidence. So showing the audience how they can apply what they've learned. This can be traditionally through an assessment with a grade, or it could be responding to feedback, answering questions, offering resource materials for further discovery. So Lakowski actually had a whole series of strategies. It's amazing how many strategies he has for creating those positive learning experiences. So what I did was I went through this material and I cherry picked the top 14 I thought would be really useful in a virtual space. And actually in the resources section, in the resources tab, if you want to download the handout, these 14 are a part of that handout. So to touch base and move forward, we're talking about the future of online learning. Again, what does these new technologies mean to us? And obviously it's about creating immersive and interactive educational environments, enabling learners to explore complex concepts in new and engaging ways. And that also means it helps instructional designers become more efficient in creating that engaging material. It's also, and this is one area I really think is going to be helpful as we get more and closer with this new technology is making it easier to create personalized learning pathways. I mean, LinkedIn Learning is already doing this, but it's tailored to individual needs. So seeing this in the corporate place of work, seeing in other, making it more accessible in other areas will really help. And adaptive learning algorithms that analyze the learner data to provide customized content, ensuring efficient and effective knowledge acquisition is really an exciting thing. I know I am almost done. I'm on the key takeaways. I'm 8 seconds over, but let me wrap this up because, I want to help you with that forgetting curve and trying to pull it all together. Make sure your learners connect to the material and know why it's relevant to them. Identify what adult learner characteristics you can tap into to make your learning experience more engaging and interesting. Keep in mind that your learners have intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, and they can have both in the same space. And ask yourself why the learners are participating in the learning experience. Lean into the type of learning orientation, goal, activity, learning, and knowing this can help you focus on their objectives, tap into their levels of motivation, and create a safe learning environment where people feel included and heard. And lastly, ask for feedback to connect with the learner and uncover ways to improve the virtual learning experience. Whew, that was a lot to cover. I know that we are over. If you have questions that we can answer, stay on for a couple more minutes. I do have one that says, how do you motivate speakers, experts to apply some of these learning tactics? So many default to didactic presentations with a handful of forced poll questions. Great question. And I would say making sure the questions you're asking, making sure that the speaker understands why they're asking this question, and also telling them what the results mean, why the results matter, why the poll, talking about something interesting based on the data that you just pulled out from a poll question, which is something that I love doing, saying, oh my gosh, 25% feel this way. This is exciting. And making sure you're asking questions that not 100% of people are going to answer the same way. Except in the beginning of this presentation, I made sure that I asked a question that all of you could start thinking a little differently, or recognizing something that you already are slightly aware of. So hopefully that answered that. It's really making sure you have that why, making it intentional. And I hope that that's helpful. Please connect with me. I offer you my LinkedIn Learning, ask questions there. I love talking about motivation. I love talking about virtual or visual design. So I appreciate your time today, and hopefully, I didn't burn you out with all this information and overload you.